Christian, our desire is for you to be successful in your journey being a Christian. That's the whole goal. It's not about entertainment or any of those things. It is all designed to draw us closer to Jesus Christ and or keep us near to Jesus Christ. That's what it's all about. Now, when we talk about grace, I want to talk about grace. Grace is a wonderful thing that God has given us as a gift. Matter of fact, if one was to ask the question, what time we're living in, we are living in the grace of God. In other words, God has given mankind, humankind, grace. That's the times we're living in right now. Grace is something that God gives us to let us know that it is something that we don't deserve, but God gives it to us. A lot of us who have credit cards, we know that you in the credit card, sometimes it gives you a grace period. You are commanded to pay your bill on a certain date, but some credit cards give you a grace period, 10-day grace period, where it gives you 10 days to respond. God gives us grace, time to respond to him. But it's important that we do not waste that grace, that we do not abuse that grace, that we don't take it for granted, if you will. Sometimes if we're not careful, we get to a point where we just forget about it or don't respect it or don't honor it or don't appreciate it. And that's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing. Why is that so important? Because we're still talking about the point or the subject, a point of no return. And we were examining the first chapter of Romans. Matter of fact, if you return to Romans, grab your Bible app and or your device, on your device, grab that. And what I would like for you to do is to first write it down. So if you could, grab a pen and paper, go ahead and write Romans chapter 1 and verse 24. Then you can turn to the verse. Why I say that? Because sometimes when you're trying to turn first and you forget what it is and you haven't written it down. So if you can write it down and then turn, it'd be good. I like this particular Bible app that I have because it keeps a history of every location that I turn to. So I don't necessarily have to write it down. It kind of writes it down for yourself. So if you're looking for a Bible app, that'd be a good app to try to obtain. So we're at Romans chapter 1 and verse 24. That's what we're going to pick up at. But I want for us to understand that grace is a gift from God. In other words, God gives us time to respond to his salvation. He blesses us even when we don't deserve it. He helps us even when we don't deserve it. But the thing is, we're looking at what could happen to a person who abuses grace. It is possible that you can abuse God's grace so much that you get to a point where there is no return. And again, we're looking at an example of people who have abused God's grace. And not only that, but I want us to have to understand. So when we're looking at certain things that's going on in our society, we want to be able to have an explanation as to what is going on. In other words, do you sometimes look and see what's going on in our culture, in our society, and you ask within yourself, why does God see this? Number two, why doesn't he do anything about it? And those are valid questions. However, at the same time, it's good for us to get to a point where we have a full understanding of what's going on before us. Now, and it's not a thing where whether or not you should be appalled about it. It's all right to be appalled. It's all right to be angry. But at the same time, it do us good to make sure that we understand the times. And here, Apostle Paul it, but again, we're looking from God's perspective. How does God look at things? So again, when you lust after, desire something that you have replaced God with, it becomes a sinful desire. And it happens all the time. This is the reason why that you and I have an enemy that tries his best to make sure that you replace God with something else. This is the reason why he oftentimes tries to push in your way to cause you to go a different direction. Someone comes along and invites you to a picnic, or someone comes along and invites you to something else that appeals to your desires, something you want to do. Oh, let's come on to an amusement park or something like that on the same day and time that church is going on. You may chuckle, but this happens all the time. The bad part about it is that sometimes you and I do not discern it. In other words, we don't stop and say, hold on. I love doing this, but can't we do that afterwards? And we're not fully aware of it. So it becomes a sinful desire. There's nothing wrong with it, but when we replace it with God, it is a problem. And churches around the country is confronted with that. Are you saying there's something wrong with vacation? Absolutely not. But when every Sunday becomes a vacation, that's a problem. Yeah. So here, Apostle Paul explaining to the saints, trying to give them an understanding of what they're seeing in the society, in our case, our culture. He's defining what is going on from God's perspective. He's trying to describe to us what happens when a person abuses God's grace and what happens. So God gives them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts. Friend, let me tell you, here Paul reveals unto us and gives them some insight about our hearts. One, there's nothing wrong with having a good heart. But the Bible also tells us and reveals unto us we cannot trust our heart. Yeah. We're living in a society and a culture that says what they tell you all the time. What's the message that the culture is giving unto us? And keep in mind, I must have you understand this. I'll ask a further question. Who is it that's influencing the culture? Satan. It's important that you and I understand that, so when the culture that has the ability to seduce us and influence us, you have to look at the big picture and understand that you have an enemy called Satan that influences the culture that he uses to appeal to your desires that you already have, and he uses your heart, which is all the Bible says is wicked above all things. Who can know it? And he uses that to seduce you. You and I. Nothing wrong with having a big heart. Nothing wrong with having a great heart. But understand this, your heart can deceive you. What do you mean? It can lead you away from God and it also can lead you to God. You just got to know the difference. The world, the culture says to us, follow your heart. What's so bad about that? That's a great saying. It's a great saying, but what they should say is follow God. That's the thing that the culture will not say, but it would tell you and I, follow your heart. And we think it's a good saying, a good slogan, a good quote, and we try to do that, and before you know, we are so far from God, it's not even funny. So again, when you're looking at our culture and how people are conducting themselves and how they're living by their own heart, which is deceiving them to lead them from God. Again, the focus here this morning is, how is it that you could be so far from God? How is it? And this is the way that it happens. Then it goes on, and we're talking more specifically about sexual sins. And again, you have no idea how the Roman culture was. The Roman culture was full of fornication, was full of homosexuality. It was full of, they had several gods that they honored. They even called themselves gods. Can you imagine living in that particular environment? that culture, that society that had those thoughts, those ideas. Now somebody say that's probably looking at the YouTube right now, probably saying within themselves, that sounded like our day to day. And I would agree. So they dishonor themselves. So again, it says here, uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. So here, Paul is addressing more specifically how that the problem was God gave them up to their own sexual desires to the extent that he just allowed them to do what they had a desire to do. But the bad thing, they did not realize and understand that they were actually dishonoring their own bodies. This is, again, from God's perspective. Now, God gave them up, which means he did not force them to sin. But because of their sin, he allowed them to go in their own, or continue rather, or go further in their own sin. And again, this is what happens. It didn't start off that way, but it came to the point where a person refuses to obey God's word, didn't respect his word, didn't live for his word. And when you continue to do that on a consistent basis, you get to a point where there is no return. There's no return. One may ask, what is fornication? Fornication is having sex without being married. So in other words, if you're not married and you're having sex, that's fornication. And fornication in general falls is an umbrella of all kinds of sexual sins. Adultery, fornication, having sex between two people, whether it's a male and female, or whether it's a male and male, or whether it's a woman and a woman, or whether it's a human being and an animal. You say, oh my God. Friend, look at the Old Testament. God created laws and telling Israel not to have sex with animals. It's in the Bible. You say how that could be, because you're looking at an example of what happens to a person that does not respect what God has given them, does not respect God's mercy and his grace and compassion. It is so bad that if you disregard that, don't respect it, don't appreciate it, you get to a point where you have sex with an animal. I'm talking about a place of no return. Paul is addressing it. Here it is, the saints are seeing this. Here it is, the saints in the midst of it. And they wonder what's going on. Does God see it? Oh, yes, he does. But what's going really on, instead of blaming God, you need to put the blame in the right place. Because again, we learned already that God speaks to us through our conscience. Knowing that God created a conscience, he speaks through our conscience, we have to go and realize and understand that these people that are doing these things, they had somebody speaking to them, the Spirit of God, through their conscience. What's the difference is that they chose to reject it. They chose to ignore it. They chose to rebel it. In other words, God was saying through their spirit that appeals to their morality, they just chose to say, I ain't listening to that. I'm going to do my own thing. What's the idea? What's the thought process today? Do your own thing. The world, the culture tells us, see, the enemy tells the culture to tell them, you do you. That's the message today. You do you. Oh, girl, you all right. You just do you. Don't worry, listen to nobody else. You keep listening to that. And it's going to translate to you, don't listen to God at all. Here it is. God is using somebody to tell you, oh, why don't you turn to God? You have a problem, you have a situation you can't solve, turn to Jesus, pray to him. Come on, come to church, let's read God's word. But the world says, you do you. And it sounds good. What is it doing? It's appealing to your heart. That deceitful place, Again, I must reiterate, there's nothing wrong with having a good heart, but also know this, that your heart can deceive you. You know, your heart can get to so bad that it will choose something else or someone else other than God. I've seen people say, follow your heart. And to them, it translated, you chase that man. Pursue that man. Forget God, just pursue him. Some people are willing to give up God and seek a man and give up everything pertaining to God. Some people are so bad and listening to their heart, they're willing to give up all the things of God and chase a woman. So in other words, instead of following God, you're following your heart. The question should be asked all the time. My heart is here, but the question should always be asked, is this causing me to go away from God or going toward God? That's a good question to ask, am I right? In any of your decisions where you know it's tugging on your heart, your question should be, is this decision that I'm about to make is going to take me from God or closer to God? Let me give you an example. Oh, I thank God I got an awesome job, wonderful job. Okay, is that job going to take you to God or away from God? Now, now everybody got to work at different hours. I'm not talking about that. But some people had strained to all their lives to get a certain career, a certain job, not realizing that in their pursuit, they didn't consider God at all. We're not talking about the person that says, yes, I got to work because I got to put food on my table, but I'm going to make sure I'm going to go to church some the times I have available. We ain't talking about you. We ain't talking about you at all. We're talking about a person that's, they'll hold on to God long enough until they get what they want. Have you ever saw a person like that? They hold on to God until God blesses them, and then once they get the blessings of God, they get off the bus and pursue other things. It happens all the time, friend. Instead of staying on the bus, means staying on the trail or the pathway or the journey and pursuing God and living for God, they get off and they pursue their things after they get what they want until the next time. But they're going to need him, and they jump back on. Well, you sure are making that plain and simple. I sure hope so. Because what you see today is really what you see. So again, when we look at that, Paul was saying, when you look at the saints, it is not that God does not see it. It is not that God is sleeping. No, what he's doing is he allowing them to do what they already wanted to do. In other words, he allowed them to go farther in sin because they had a desire to do so. It is not God's fault. It's that person's fault. In other words, God chose not to restrain them through his grace. Then again, grace is a wonderful thing. I thank God for grace because if it wasn't for grace, none of us would be saved. If it wasn't for grace, for God holding back his natural response to sin, which is to kill. You want to ever have an example what sin, how God responds to sin? Read the Old Testament. He would have those folks lay hands on the animal that's about to be sacrificed as symbolic of transfer of their judgment from them to the animal. And what would they do with their animal? They would cut the throat, cut it up, burn it on the altar. What's so about that? Because what was being done to the animal should be done to us. Why is that? Because God responds naturally to that. But God's grace said, no, instead of killing you, instead of cutting your throat, I'm going to put a substitute. And my actions toward you is called grace. And God is telling us, stop wasting your time, wasting my grace. But what the folks were doing They were abusing God's grace, so God just gave them up. Elder Davis, always growing up, he always, talking about us growing up in church, he would have some sayings, and we'd be cracking up. We would think, we'd say, my goodness, because we never heard a lot of stuff he would say I never heard of. One of them is, you give a monkey enough rope, he going to hang himself. Friend, let me tell you, God gave them up, allowed them to go deeper in their own sins. Why? Because they demanded to. So when we look at society today and look at what's going on in the culture, don't be shocked. I'm not saying not be mad, but don't be shocked. Look at the people that refuse to respect God. Look at the people that refuse to believe in God. Look at the people that refuse to respond to and appreciate God's grace. And let it be an example to you and I, so that you and I don't abuse God's grace. And let it be an example to what can happen to a person when they abuse God's grace. Should it scare me to death? It scares me. Because if I don't appreciate God's grace, the time in which he's given me, in which I do not deserve, I can get to the same place. Man, that's scary, man. Can you imagine somebody, here it is, you have knowledge, there is a pit that's a few yards from a person, and you're looking at this person, you say, hey, come on, get away from there, you're about to fall in that pit, and they say, I ain't listening to you, mind your business. And you're seeing them, you're looking at them, and they're getting closer and closer to the pit. And the more you try to reach out to them, the more you try to help them, the more you try to care, they refuse to listen. And then what is going to eventually happen? I know it's simplistic, but it needs to be simplistic so you can fully understand. They fall in the pit. The worst thing about falling in the pit, that you had a chance to avoid the pit, but you chose to not listen to a warning. These people choose not to listen to the warning. So again, you can see it, and you get so far that it becomes and transfers from disobedience and goes further than that to blasphemy. In other words, you can disobey and you still have a chance to turn around. You still have a chance to repent. You still have a chance to get it right. But when you persist in rebellion, that's what it's called, rebellion. When we persist in rebellion, keep going forward, it can get to where you start blaspheming God. We're talking about the point of no return. So when you see these things in our society and understand, you have rejected God so much. And look where you're at now. You have rejected God so much that God just gave you up. It's like that child that refused, they're so rebellious. Kid don't listen to their parents at all. That's a dangerous child. Because there's nothing that child will not do. My brother was telling me about some things going on in Philly. Can you imagine your child killing you? Can you imagine your child beating you up? Would God stand for that? Read the Old Testament, friend. What God say about if you have an unruly child? It was an example in the Bible that was talked about that. Brought it to Moses and them. God ain't playing. What those parents have to do, gave them up. He won't listen to us, gave them up. Friend, let me tell you, that ought to scare you and I. It ought to give us a lesson, a personal lesson, that if I don't get a hold of myself, if I don't start appreciating God's grace, and you that is still living right now, you have asked God for certain things in prayer, but yet you in return, you haven't given thanks, haven't given glory and honor to him at all. You may ask the question, is that borrowed grace? I mean, not borrowed grace, but abuse of grace? Oh, yes. Yes. But you don't want to ever get to a place where you get to a place of no return. No return, friend. In other words, God gave them up to their sinful condition. Gave them up to the sinful desires of their heart. Be careful what your heart is communicating to you. Because if you're not careful, it can cause you to give up God. If anything that's in your heart makes you feel good, sounds good, but it causes you to go away from God, you shouldn't be listening to your heart. And please keep this in mind. The enemy can send something or someone in your life because the enemy knows our hearts and how we follow and respond to our hearts. And be careful and ask yourself the question. And this can keep you saved. This can keep you continue on the path. Ask yourself, is this taking me away or causing me to go closer? Simple. It's so simple that the enemy works night and day to make sure you don't ever get to that place where you fully understand that. I want you to understand the enemy wants us, including me, to be ignorant. From the North Philly translation, in the North Philly translation, it means stupid. He wants us to be in that particular thing. Not aware of what he is doing and not aware of what God says. It's just simple as that, but yet profound. Because it's being done and executed every single day. And every time that you overlook, don't take advantage of an opportunity to come into the house of God and learn about his word, is being conducted in your own life. You may laugh at it, say it ain't real, but yet if you sit on that couch and don't respond, you are being tricked by the enemy at this moment in time. And you are on your way of no return. He wants us to be comfortable in our condition. He doesn't want us to change. He doesn't want us to draw closer to God. Why is that? What a good question, because the Bible says when you and I draw closer to God, what happens? God will draw closer to us. And he doesn't want that to happen. This is the reason why he works so hard to make sure you don't make it to church. You don't make it to Bible study. This is the reason why he tries so hard to make sure that you don't pray, that you don't read God's word, because if you discover his word, then you have a chance to be saved. You have a chance to be delivered. He don't want you and I to be delivered. He wants us to be condemned. He wants us to be down. He wants us to be oppressed. He wants us to be depressed. He wants us to feel lost, if you please. He wants to make sure that you don't come in contact with the light of God, which is God's knowledge and understanding. Because if you do, you will have a chance to be saved. You and I don't think really appreciate how our enemy thinks and how motivated he is against us. One thing we need to understand, I'm just going to share this with you so that you can fully understand his motivation. Do you not know, and we'll go through this later on, but do you not know that Satan was created? He's an angel, was an angel, archangel. Do you not know that? And I'm saying it just in case you don't know. Some people don't know. Because the society and the culture make it seem or imply that Satan is another form of a god. You look at the movies, and I look at these, I say, man, where are they going? They make Satan look like he's a god and nothing you can do. And the only reason why they can do that because you and I, when I say you and I, society is ignorant of the fact that this Satan was a created being. What's so special about that? The creation can never be greater than the creator. In other words, The one that created him is greater than him. I'll clap on that. But the enemy want to use influence by the culture to cause you and I to believe that he's equal to God, his creator. The difference between you and I, we were created, humankind, we were created by God. What's the difference between us and the angels? A big difference. See, the angels were created in complete knowledge. You and I were created, but yet we don't have that complete knowledge. We're still looking through a glass trying to figure everything out. But for the angels, that was not so. They understood 100%. What's the difference between us making a mistake and them? Us, because we don't have full knowledge, you can understand that. But for an angel, there is no excuse. Last time I checked, none of us was in the heaven when we were created, were we? Last time I checked, we didn't behold God's face. Job had no idea what was going on, but Satan understood clearly. What's the difference between that? When you have a full knowledge and you reject God and rebel, this is the reason why they don't have or be able to participate in redemption. Because the difference between you and I, they had full knowledge. And they chose deliberately to rebel. Therefore, they don't get redemption. Knowing that, the enemy looks at you and I and says, how is it that God can redeem you and forgive you when you mess up human beings, but yet he refuses to forgive us? So his motivation is to make sure that he kills, destroys, like the sister was saying the other day in the message. Because God has given you and I the opportunity to be redeemed. And he didn't give it to them. Satan and all the fallen angels that follow him. Can you imagine how mad and upset you would be? And you wonder why he tries his best to destroy us, to get back at God. In other words, God chose not, this is again, God chose not to restrain them through his grace. God gives us grace, but he chose not to restrain them, chose not to hold them back, chose not to cause them to turn around, even while he's giving them grace. Friend, that's scary. That is scary. Friend, I'd rather have somebody say, hold on, you're going in the wrong direction. Let's turn this around. Than to say, go ahead. That's scary. Grace is a restraining thing. But God withdraws that. You in trouble, friend. You're in trouble. But he allowed them the freedom to do what they demanded to do. So when you see when the culture goes so far and they're doing things that is still shocking you in your mind, you say, God, what's going on? Don't you see? Yes, he sees. But don't you see? This is what happened to a person that refuses to obey me. This is a person that refuses all my, when Paul was on the road to Damascus and he said, he finally got Paul's attention. And Paul said, who art thou? And he said, and the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you persecuted. Then he further goes on to explain that you kicking against the pricks. Here it is, I'm trying to prick your heart. Here it is, I'm trying to touch your heart. Here it is, I'm trying to get a hold of your heart to get your attention. But you keep rebutting it. You keep rejecting it. You keep rejecting everything I say. And we do that all the time. God is pricking people's hearts. This is the reason why we're praying and ask God to touch people's hearts, speak to their conscience, to get their attention. But when you continue to rebel, you continue to reject them, you can continue to ignore it, God, you could put yourself in a place where God would just let you go. And you get to a place you're doing things you never thought you would do. You get so far and say, how in the world I get to this place? The reason why, because God gave you up so much that he allowed and gave you the freedom to do what you want to do. Just heard a sister say this morning, be careful what you ask for. Because you may discover after you get it, you may not want it. Careful what you ask for. Again, he gave them up to their own sinful desires of their own heart. Friend, how do we deal with the heart? Create in me a clean heart and renew within me a right spirit. You ask God to guide and direct your heart. Friend, again, you have one of those hearts, those big hearts, and nothing wrong with it, but I'm going to let you know that's both a blessing and a curse. Person with a big heart, they have the ability to be able to have empathy for someone. At the same time, if you're not careful and don't guard your heart, you can be guided by your heart and lead you to a place away from God. Yes, God is great and he's so awesome, but if you're not careful, your heart can cause you to give up God and pursue what your heart wants and don't think twice about it. Friend, I don't never want that. I want a heart, don't get me wrong. I want a heart to be able to reach folks and feel for them, but I don't want no heart to lead me away from God. Then it can happen in all forms, not just a person. I'm talking about also things. Your heart can lead you to things that will not prosper you spiritually. I hope and pray I communicated that to you today. How that if we're not careful, we get to a place of no return. I hope and pray that you consider everything I said today, and you consider whether or not you are abusing the grace of God. I know God is talking to people. Every now and then you get a chance to talk to somebody one-on-one. When they're around folks, they won't say nothing. When you're one-on-one and you begin to know them, they start opening up, and you get to, wait a minute, hold on, God has been dealing with you? Why aren't you in church? Why aren't you responding? You mean tell me God saved your life and you ain't go back to church? Friend, don't abuse God's grace. You are experiencing God's grace. If God's grace was withdrawn from our lives, you'd be homeless, destitute, sick, everything else. What's keeping you? God's grace. My lasting words, don't abuse it, friend, because you can get to the place of no return. Of no return. You can come into a place where you can talk to a person that once knew God, and then you talk to them after they continue to abuse it, and you talk to them again as if they never knew God at all. I've seen it. I seen it. And couldn't believe it. It scared me half to death. Because if this brother or this sister can get to that place, I don't want to get there. Till next time, I hope and pray that God blesses you and your family. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments. It doesn't take you long to type a few words. I appreciate it in advance. And I hope and pray that you remember to give God your best and not your leftovers. Until then, be blessed in Jesus' name.